Brought to you by Penguin.
Christmas with the Shipyard Girls by Nancy Revell. Read by Janine Birkett.
And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. 1 Corinthians, chapter 13, verse 13. Prologue. Gibraltar, 21st of June, 1942. Tommy looked up at the darkening sky. Its palette of yellow and orange, mixed with an array of blues, reminded him of the huge oil paintings that Arthur had taken him to see as a child in the town's museum. His granda had told him that a person could learn a lot about the world simply by looking at these depictions of days gone by. But all Tommy had wanted to do was run out of the musty-smelling exhibition room and look up at the real skies and stare out at the real sea. "Here you are." A woman's soft voice drew his eyes away from the oil-painted sky. "Let's get this around you." Tommy looked at the pretty face of the nurse as she bent over his stretcher and tucked a blanket tightly around his body. She nearly lost her balance a few times as the lifeboat bobbed about in the choppy waters. "Help's on its way," she reassured. Tommy felt her palm on his forehead. Her hands were icy cold, cooling his hot brow. "You're cold," Tommy mumbled. The nurse smiled, but didn't say anything. Tommy looked at her familiar white pinafore, emblazoned with the distinctive emblem of the Red Cross, and he suddenly realized that he didn't know her name. Hers was the only face he had seen during his spells of consciousness. He'd heard the living and the dying since he'd been hauled on board the hospital ship, but hers was the only face he'd seen, or at least remembered. Turning his head to the side, Tommy looked out at the Atlantic Ocean, which was now covered in a layer of black oil from the ship's fractured fuel tank. He could just make out the ship itself, its white flank slowly disappearing beneath the surface. "Here! Over here!" Tommy felt the lifeboat sway as two dark figures got to their feet and started shouting and waving their hands. He craned his neck. "See? I told you." The nurse put her cold hand on his forehead again, before easing a thermometer into his mouth. "They've come to get us." Tommy heard the Yorkshire dales in her accent. There was lots of movement, shouts, cries of jubilation, as the ship's grey bow ploughed towards them, a sense of euphoria spreading through the packed lifeboat as salvation approached. Tommy watched as the nurse took the thermometer out of his mouth and looked at it. Her face was sombre. "And not a moment too soon," she muttered, grabbing the side of the boat, unsteadied by the swell created by the approach of their rescuers. "Come on." She put her arm around Tommy's shoulders and helped him to sit up. "I want you to be one of the first off." Tommy's body was shaking, but he didn't feel at all cold. "Listen!" A man's voice next to him suddenly shouted out. The excitement died down, and that's when they all heard it, an ominous drone above them. Looking up, they saw a lone bomber thudding its way across the sky. Its target was obvious. There were no ships within sight other than the one coming to their rescue. "Please, God, no!" Tommy saw panic and alarm on the young nurse's face as she made the sign of the cross. Turning his vision back to the sky's oil-painted canvas, he could just about make out the bomber's metal underbelly, releasing its innards, and the outline of 3 giant-sized bullets as they careered through the air, seesawing awkwardly before smashing into the sea.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?